Susan Case is Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. And her work focuses on gender and diversity issues, a whole lot of interesting questions within that, differences between men and women's communication patterns, the kind of barriers that women face in management, including some of the tougher ones like discrimination, hostile work environment, harassment, and so on. So I'm pleased to introduce Susan Case.
Well, with that introduction, you probably wonder, why am I here in a conference on religion and business? So let me start with a story that puts the work I've been doing, and this is my fourth paper related to some aspect of moral responsibility, integrity, ethics education, the 10 Commandments of character, and I want to put this in a context. So we're going to do some time travel. Go back to when I'm about 12 years old. And I'm having this big fight with my mother at the dinner table. And I get really angry. I throw my chair down as I get up and I run to my room. I start crying. I slam my door and there's my mother is stomping down the hallway, coming after me. She opens the door and she says to me, "Susan, no crying. If you don't like what I said, if you think it's unfair and unjust, then you stand up to me and you tell me what's right. You tell me what you want." My gosh, what kind of parenting is that? So, what am I hearing? It's important to stand up when authority figures do unjust things. All right, then, growing up, I also had a grandmother who came from the old country, from an area of Russia, who only spoke Yiddish. And I would hear this word all the time. You're not a mensch, you gotta be a mensch. What did that mean? That meant have compassion, be kind, treat people well, and those were messages I took in. Now, I grew up in a military family, and in that military family, I was always the only Jewish child in my school. So I didn't have a Jewish community, but in spite of that, my family were people of the book, and they were people who lived culturally with Jewish values. They never said, this is a Jewish value. In fact, part of this journey of being here was my sabbatical when I spent a year reading the Torah, the Talmud, the Bible, and the Quran to discover the roots of these messages that I hadn't realized were Jewish. Then I got into that journey because I had a graduate student who's now a professor at Pepperdine, a Christian university. She was a social gospel Christian, and she taught as my TA in my diversity class. She got very interested in interfaith work, and she was reading about Judaism, and she calls me and she said, "How come I taught with you 7 times? You never once mentioned you were Jewish. You never once said that the way you're teaching is embedded with Jewish values." Now, as a social gospel Christian who's very much an activist around social justice issues, she said to me, "Why are we leaving religion and our faith traditions that are the soul of who we are and how we act in the world? Why are they left out of the classroom?" So as I said, I went on sabbatical. I tried to learn more about these messages, and all of a sudden it dawned on me. My parents were teaching me what it meant for me as a young Jewish woman to live ethically in the world and do justice and show compassion and have integrity. And it was like, oh my God, my roots. How did I miss them? All right, so I come back to school and I'm all into my narrative and my understanding, and I say, here's this paper I just wrote in a draft form. Let me use it in the classroom. That's this paper. I give it to my students. When I give it to them, there's concern. Oh my God, religion. We don't talk about religion. We're a secular university. And I brought it into the classroom, and one of my atheist students, he was actually a Palestinian, who said to me, I'm out of the closet. I'm able for the first time to say I'm an atheist. And you know what? I guess I've grown up in a Judeo-Christian culture, and the values talked about in this paper are values that I also believe. Who knew? So the conversation shifted. Unlike what some of people have said, it's divisive. What we found was, although I've taken the best of each religion's, Moses, I'm aware of what you say, but I've handpicked the best to show where there are common values. And when the students found the common values, their dialogue about hard issues like transgendered or sexual orientation or Jewish and Palestinian issues, they could have conversations where they listened respectfully and asked questions. So I wanted to put that context in as I've begun experimenting with bringing religion into the classroom. I'm basically exploring something that I think if we all understood and used, the understanding of common values from the sacred texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can be used to cultivate and sustain moral behavior at work. I want to briefly mention some of the constructs. One of them is my own construct of integrity with my co-author, who pointed out I'm very Jewish. She and I have now been writing together. And I want to link the few empirical studies I've been able to find, and I only found 5, although a new one came up today as I listened, that link religious beliefs to ethical workplace behavior. Talk very briefly about how integrity is looked at in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Then I want to just highlight briefly in 5 areas the workplace and how it's viewed across the religions for employers, for employees, the notion of mutual responsibility, the notion of dignity of work, then buying, selling, usury, the commonalities around environmental stewardship, and social justice and social responsibility. And as I said, I'm going to be talking about the best of the religions and trying to reconstruct ancient wisdom so that it can guide people's personal understanding for making decisions in the workplace and in their life. Okay. All 3 religions are monotheistic religions. So if you go back to Abraham, who lived over 4,000 years ago, and all of these religions are people of the book. Christianity came out of Judaism, and Islam came out of both Judaism and Christianity. And there's these unrecognized commonalities about moral character and morally responsible behavior that are important for the global marketplace. In fact, the first draft of this paper, I don't know how somebody saw it, but I got some responses from Nigeria with people who were so surprised that anybody was talking about this. And I've been having this conversation because Nigeria has a very strong Christian and a very strong Catholic population, especially in the banking and financial industry. And we've been having conversations about how you begin doing this work. I think you can apply a religiously defined lens to how we look at issues of what I will call right and wrong. There's great complexity, I'm aware, but when you get this internal set of ethics that you embody, and then you allow that spiritual backpack, I'll call it, coming into the workplace, you can draw on personally how you might think about ethical decision-making. There actually, much to my surprise, I did not expect as much commonality as there was on standards for what it means to act with moral responsibility and standards about what is unethical. All 3 religions talk about those things. So what has surprised me is how little in a business school we ever draw on these thousands of years of sustained efforts to build moral communities. Our religious texts can be guides to cultivate the best of our capabilities and contribute to ethical, maybe even virtuous behavior in organizations. Okay, the literature reflects, and I'm not going to give you who these authors are, but it reflects a lot of things that kind of link to integrity, but you hear words like wholeness and authenticity, consistency in behavior. There are a lot of virtues, like honesty and fairness, but the focus is usually on compliance. It's on upholding the rules, and yet we talk about them. I teach leadership, executive leadership. In our classes, we talk about these things are important to good leaders, but there's actually no leadership theory of integrity. There's no leadership theory of moral responsibility, and there's no instruments to measure what is integrity in action. So in another paper that I did, I defined integrity. In Proverbs, they say, people with integrity have firm footing, but those who follow crooked paths will slip and fall. I wish with the financial crisis, more people would be held accountable. My husband says they should all be put in prison. But maybe the company is paying fines, but the individuals are not being held accountable. So my definition does incorporate the notion that integrity is part of one's character. And it consists of discrete virtues, such as the characteristics mentioned, behavioral consistency between words and actions, espoused values and enacted values, across time and across situations, avoiding hidden agendas, and acting morally, transparently, and sincerely from internal values, even in the face of adversity or temptation. Such behavior demonstrates a commitment to principled behavior, standing courageously for religiously anchored principles, bearing the difficult consequences of convictions, and acting ethically and altruistically. So I believe from our religious upbringing, if you were brought up where you had it, you develop a conscience. There's something in Jewish upbringing that you feel guilty if you don't behave, if you don't do the right thing. So that conscience actually provides courage to have candor, to speak the truth for what you think is wrong, to stand up to authority, to make changes, to stand up for the underdog, to help someone when they need help. So scriptures provide this living code for ethical behavior. At the time, in much digging, I found only 5 studies. I talk about this positive link between religious beliefs and ethical workplace behaviors, and that's been documented. In the study by Werner, which I mentioned, they talked about that Christians who felt a calling, who felt God put them into the occupation they were in, were much more concerned about ethical business conduct, including business and its relationship to a community and building community. In Longnecker's work, and Conroy and Edison, how did those all get 1, 1, 1? I'm looking at my notes. Mine says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyway, the more religiously inclined individuals exhibit better decision-making in ethical contexts. So in this Longnecker study, they did a questionnaire of 1,200 Christians, Muslims, and Jews who were managers, and they gave them 16 questionable business decisions. They found that individuals who had a higher religious identity salience had a lower acceptance of what they perceived to be unethical or questionable decisions, and much higher standards of right and wrong. Conroy and Edison, they looked at the role of religiosity, but then they also looked at the role of ethics education in business schools. And they looked at undergraduate and graduate students in one public and one private Christian university. And they, again, gave them scenarios similar to what Longnecker did, 25 ethical scenarios. And the degree of religious affiliation was associated with higher ethical standards. Taking an ethics course had no relationship to ethical behavior. Okay. The Bramer study analyzed religious affiliation in Western and Eastern religions. So they brought that in. And they looked at attitudes toward corporate social responsibility. They looked at 20 countries and 17,000 people. Religious individuals had much broader views of what it meant to be socially responsible than those who were non-religious. It included poverty relief, environmental stewardship, community support, human rights, equal opportunity, and going beyond the letter of the law, okay? Garfield and Captain did an actual study of 20 executives in Holland. They were of different religions. And again, there was more evidence that those who had strong religious identity, strong religious beliefs, were more socially responsible in their business decisions. Okay. All right. Many people apply religiously derived ethical standards in their personal life. Part of the problem is they don't bring those, like what I call their spiritual backpack or their ethical code, into the workplace. Some of you may be aware of Jackal's 1988 work called Moral Mazes, The World of Corporate Managers. That was an in-depth study of multi-organizations in terms of leadership, moral behavior. And what they found was that right and wrong was determined by who had the most clout in organizations. So what's right is what the guy above you wants you to do. What's right is not what you might do in your home and your church. Yet at the same time that we've separated, there's an explosion in the workplace of spirituality and faith-based work movement. There's even a new division in the Academy of Management called Management of Religion and Spirituality, where people are really searching for a way that meaning can be brought back into work. And employees are unsure how to bring their faith into the workplace. So again, that fear that people won't understand. And part of where I'm going with this is saying we need to break that fear down, because once you have dialogue, you begin to break down real dialogue, not debate, not discussion, not being right, but the ability to respect and listen to perspectives. You can often find commonalities. So when we look at the three religions, they have a lot in common. They have a lot to tell us about the workday world. Scriptures highlight principles, virtues, duties, rights, and responsibilities of organizations and their stakeholders. All three religions, in quotes, command people to live morally responsible and accountable lives and to correct the world's imperfections. Are constructed in terms of responsibilities, not in terms of rights. And unlike Adam Smith, the ethics of these religions believes that self-interest should be overcome for the common good. I found, as I did my own narrative journey and exploration, that they did provide me a guiding light for moral and ethical dilemmas, to do the right thing even if no one's looking, and to stand up for something or someone even if it puts you at risk. Okay, just quickly, I'm going to go through how moral responsibility and integrity is looked at in each of the three religions. So the Talmudic sage Rabbah said, when a person dies, the first question asked in heaven is, did you deal honestly in business? Judaism is a religion about behavior. So doing Torah, acting in an ethical way, forms the basis for Jewish character. And the Talmud provides an ethical framework with extensive guidelines, especially about business behavior and managing others with integrity, with a strong concern for social justice. And there's 4 attitudes that distinguish it from unrestrained capitalism. One is equal justice under the law. This comes from we were slaves under Pharaoh in Egypt. 2, improve the world through responsible stewardship. The earth and all that is in it belongs to God. 3, people have infinite worth. I think of Martin Buber and the I thou kind of distinction. So you imitate God, and I lives in relationship to the world. so you protect the dignity of everyone. And the last one, go beyond the law to do what's right. And this is what was just talked about at lunch. It's exceeding legal obligations. What you're doing is enforcing the law's spirit. And there's an openness and transparency in market conduct beyond what the profit motive would dictate. Okay. In Christianity, you expect the expected business behavior comes through the parables. And the parables explain employee-employer expectations, work ethic, forgiveness, benevolence, a long-term orientation, contingency planning, agency, service. And through the parables, when you look at it, unlike this very big code that Judaism has, and Islam has a similar code, in Christianity, people will often say, well, what you do is you do what Jesus would do. So you model your practice and your leadership style after Jesus, including his charitable actions and integrity toward others. All religions, and Christianity in particular, talks about individual freedom, but with freedom comes responsibility. And faith becomes a source of ethical guidance. In the parable of the two sons, doing right is more highly regarded than speaking right. So, as Pope John Paul II said, the purpose of a business firm is found in its very existence as a community of purpose, community of persons at the service of the whole of society. And as also mentioned earlier, the recognition of original sin implies that business and economic behavior can be corrupted by self-centeredness and self-interest. Islam, the ethical codes organize all of life. So when you observe Islam, it leads to happiness in this world and a promise in the hereafter. And to have that promise in the hereafter, your ethical conduct in economic affairs is integral. The system prescribes behavior for all kinds of business allowed to eliminate what's called zulim, the inequality, exploitation, oppression, and injustice. And like Judaism, Islam focuses on behavior rather than belief, law rather than dogma. And it's very concerned with community. Work is a religious duty to be done to perfection. The economic concepts are virtually identical in the three. Intentions matter, behavior matters, choice have consequences. And in Islam, you also have this concept of adala, equality, fairness, economic justice. Those override the principles of the free market. And the belief is everybody should be able to earn a living without government intervention. All right, so in moving into workplace integrity, all three religions believe people should be able to work, they should be provided work, that work gives people dignity, a sense of self-worth, a sense of being able to take care of themselves, their family, and give to their community. It differs in each of them in terms of, are they contractual, covenantal? Judaism is more contractual. They allow organizing and bargaining to minimize employees' coercive power. But at the time their focus on mutual rights and responsibilities came about, Jews were employed by Jews. So they lived in a covenantal community, caring about the community, but they had contractual rights. Christianity is more about mutual relationships. The firm's purpose is service of the whole society. Again, that was what Pope John Paul said. And I was thinking of the many Christian people who I didn't even realize how Christian their organizations were until I got into this work. But one of the organizations I've used in case studies has been Herman Miller, which is a very high-end manufacturing company. The former chairman, Max Dupree, basically said in 1988 that the capitalistic system cannot avoid being better off by having more employees who act as if they own the place. And his successor, Hermit Campbell, believed the company's mission at Herman Miller wasn't to create products, but to liberate the human spirit. This is very much in keeping with the Christian views of the importance of work. Now, I used to teach Robert Greenleaf's work, Servant Leadership. I used it in my classes. Lo and behold, I didn't know that this was Christianity masked as secular in his work on, he was a social gospel Christian who converted to Quakerism. He worked at AT&T for years doing servant leadership, and it didn't dawn on me. Servant? Who's the servant? Is Moses the servant? Is Jesus the servant? But he really has a very strong Christian ethic around work, and he talked a lot about a calling. And he wanted people to live their faith in the workplace and follow the servant leadership model of Jesus, nurturing the growth of people, of institutions, and community. Now, many organizations are members of the servant leadership group. Southwest Airlines, my favorite airline, very Christian. Servant leadership is its model. Service Master, all kinds of subgroups that develop products and services for us. Templeton Mutual Funds, they all explicitly connect faith, the Christian faith, with work, and they use servant leadership as their guide. The Christian message: people are God's representatives on earth. You honor the Creator by exercising your individual rights through partnership with others in society. Islam has elements of both of these in it. Okay. Now, we've talked, what? 3 more minutes?
I want to leave some time for
Oh my goodness. Gonna be, okay. So I'll do this one, and then I'll give you a sense of what else was there, that if you read the paper. Responsibilities of the employer. To do what's right because it's right. Exceed the legal requirements. Respect dignity. Provide safe working conditions and opportunities. Be honest in all dealings. Provide wages and benefits sufficient to live with dignity and meet the basic needs of the worker. And have responsibilities to community welfare. Some of you may know the story of Aaron Firestein, who was the owner of Malden Mills factory in Lawrence, Massachusetts. A fire ripped through his factory in 1995. And this was a town that was a factory town. Most of the people there were immigrants, and they depended on this factory for their livelihood. He knew it would take 3 months to rebuild and get the factory working again. He decided, as a devout Jew, that he was going to pay his employees, his 2,800 employees, their salary for 90 days and their health insurance for 180 days, and rebuild the mill. This cost him $15 million. He was taking a chance that this loyalty and investment in his employees would have them work creatively, which they did, work 25 hours a week, in order to rebuild the factory, to get the factory back to capacity in 90 days. He could have relocated, like most of his competitors did, where labor's cheaper, land's cheaper. He could have retired. He was 70 years old. He could have just closed the company down, like many other companies did. But he decided to stay for financial and ethical reasons, because he saw his role as a devout Jew to provide purpose and livelihood and serve the community. And he built his business based on his view that you're not permitted to oppress the working man. And this was respecting God. So he basically went beyond the letter of the law into his own piety of his belief system. Eventually, the company was taken over. It doesn't exist today, but for a good 9 years after this, it was a profitable company. All right. Just to give you a sense of what else, there are similar responsibilities of workers that if your employers treat you well, you owe them a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. So you have to do your best for the employer. All 3 religions say that. There's this sense about work are places that encourage people and give them the kind of jobs where they can develop and flourish. Work should be its own reward. It shapes lives. It shapes dignity. In terms of buying and selling, again, you have the sense of no deception, no harmful products like subprime mortgages or payday lending. You're committed to honest dealings in day-to-day business with regulations to control deliberate deception in the marketplace. Usury, religions always allow creditors to recoup the money, but all three say you don't have to. All forbid exploiting the poor and charging unreasonable interest like payday lending does. Scriptures from each ask creditors to be humane. How different our financial crisis might be if banks had allowed renegotiating of mortgages or short selling or stopped foreclosing on houses. A whole area of Cleveland is just nothing but empty houses because people couldn't get the banks to help them out. All talk about people being in co-stewardship with the world that God created. And we're interconnected, so this responsibility to the environment is important. As mentioned before, a lot of companies have focused on sustainability, many of them very strong Christian companies, where they've learned they can do well by doing good. And actually, the companies that do this have a 60% higher return on investment over a 3-year period over the laggards. Social justice, again, you've got companies who very much believe in long-term results. They use the golden rule very much in how they do things. Ben & Jerry's was founded on the golden rule. And they believe in kindness and compassion to their employees, their suppliers, their customers, their community. And 2 years ago, I actually heard Jerry Greenfield speak here. He was one of the co-founders, and he spoke at the Washington Jewish Community Federation. And he basically said his religious education as a Jew sensitized him to discrimination, marginalization, and the needs of other people around the world. He also said, as you help others, you're helped in return. And just because the idea of to do good comes back to you as written in the Bible and not in some business textbook doesn't mean that it's any less valuable. So I just wanted to mention that example, because here's another company that is doing good and making a profit. My implications are we are founded on Judeo-Christian values, and these provide a roadmap for transcending cultural change at work and life. We share moral and ethical spiritual values across the religions, and this offers relevant advice for workplace integrity and morally responsible behavior. I wanted to mention an example of this Christianity being in the background, because as the implications, as I was thinking about this, just 2 days ago, John Kasich, our governor, Republican, ended up doing a back run around our legislature that 3 times had voted against expanding Medicaid to people under the new health care plan. And he got it passed, and there'll now be 250,000 more people, mostly drug-addicted, homeless people, or people who are mentally ill. That's the bulk of the population who will be added. And he said, I have to do this because the most vulnerable in our population, we've got a war against these people who are poor. And when asked why, I mean, he's a Republican, and he's very Republican, he said, my Christian compassion tells me it's the right thing to do. And then I read in the Wall Street Journal on the airplane a very critical response to him. They called him, who does he think he is, the Apostle Kasich? So here's a man that although when he thinks about things, his Christianity has made him the most progressive governor in the last 20 years about money for the mentally ill, and somebody who says compassion is important to how we do things. So I think the implications are not that religion is a prerequisite for being moral, but what religion does is it's a counterforce to self-interest and short-term gain. And it allows us to have a different kind of dialogue. I mean, I don't usually connect with Kasich, but around these issues, we have found a bond where we can talk about things where we're in alignment to make a difference. So, the implications are society benefits from our having these conversations, and this can be a foundation for ethical conscience and moral courage to take appropriate action. And I'm looking more at the individual and what the individual, by their awareness about their own traditional views, can lead to dialogue where you can find much in common, you can challenge the perceptions and stereotypes of what's accepted, and create a new kind of social contract. Virtue is the product of habituated behavior, so you have to keep acting, according to Aristotle. And as I was reminded on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's death, the time is always right to do what's right. I actually only took my original 30 minutes because we didn't start. We were told 30 minutes and then 15 minutes question answer. So I was going fast, but I stayed on my time. See, stand up to authority. I learned it well.
I have a question about how you deal with the diversity within the three different religious groups that you're talking about. Within Christianity, Judaism, and the Islamic faith, it's certainly not homogeneous in
Right.
People's perspectives on what the values are.
Right. The only way I can respond to that is based on my own experience in the companies I've done some consulting in and in my own classrooms at the MBA level and at the undergraduate level. And what I found is that just people surprisingly discovering that they have anything in common by having that conversation means all of the things that are different don't matter. I've had religious Jews, and I've had very secular Jews, or I've had used to be Jews, I've had Muslims, I've had fundamentalist Muslims that are rather extreme. But what they find is when they find that commonality, or even realize as an atheist, for example, the golden rule. I had a student who grew up with hippie parents. And when we were doing this, she said, "You mean that's based on religion? That's in the Bible? I thought that was just one of those hippy-dippy things that my parents told me about." So that lack of knowledge about their own heritage is really missing, and yet I did not find divisiveness. What I found is a breaking down of walls and stereotypes and the ability to engage in a conversation that they didn't know they could have, that led to a mutual respect, not agreement, but an ability to talk about issues in a deeper way with real dialogue. And that was surprising to me. And it happened in workplace as well.
Okay, well, let's give Susan